I was rinsing the dinner plates when my son said it. "Mom, you're dead weight." I set the towel down. Not a word, not a scene. Just 2 suitcases, a coat, and the porch light winking at my back. 6 weeks later, my name was on the lease to his company's office. Not out of spite, out of clarity. If you believe in starting over at any age, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Your voice matters, and this is mine. Let me tell you how we got there. My name is Margaret. I turned 61 the month my knees decided stairs were optional, and my son decided he didn't need my advice anymore. But back when he was 22, fresh out of college with a head full of ideas and a checking account emptier than my pantry after Thanksgiving, it was me who kept the lights on. I remember those nights in the garage, the hum of a space heater fighting the cold, the smell of solder and instant noodles, the sound of his fingers typing code like his life depended on it. I would bring him sandwiches stacked too high and a thermos of coffee that tasted more like burnt hope than beans. He would look up, hair in his eyes, and smile just enough for me to know I was helping. When investors didn't answer his emails, I stayed up and proofread his pitch decks, circling the spelling errors and underlining the numbers that made no sense. When his friends lost interest, I sat in the back row at every demo day, clapping until my palms stung, so he would hear at least one voice rooting for him. And when the landlord posted a late rent notice on the garage door, it was my credit card that paid the balance. "Just a bridge, Mom," he promised, sliding the receipt onto the fridge like a trophy. Bridges became a pattern, and I became the quiet architect of all of them. I told myself it was worth it. That's what mothers do. We carry weight our children don't yet know exists. Weight of bills, of patience, of prayers said in kitchens when no one's listening. I didn't want medals. I wanted to see him fly. And for a while he did. The garage became an office, the sandwiches became catered lunches, the thermos of burnt coffee was replaced with cold brew in glass bottles. But sometimes, when success finally knocks, gratitude slips out the back door. That night at the dinner table, I still set down my old casserole dish, I still poured sweet tea the way he liked it, and I still believed, foolishly, that I belonged at that table as more than decoration. It was Tuesday. I know because I still had the church bulletin folded in my purse and the leftover ham from Sunday warming in the oven. I'd baked cornbread, the way he always asked for as a boy, golden edges crisp, middle soft enough to hold butter. We sat at the table, my son at the head, his wife to his right, me across from her. I could feel the distance even though the chairs were close, the kind of distance you don't measure in inches, but in silences. He was scrolling on his phone between bites of chicken. His wife was talking about a networking event, all bright laughter with her hand resting neatly on the stem of her glass. I tried to keep up, nodding, smiling in the pauses, slipping in a story about the first pitch I ever helped him write, back in that garage. That's when he set his fork down, not gently, not roughly, just enough to mark a pause. He said, "Mom, you're dead weight." The words floated for a moment as if they weren't even sure they belonged in the air. His wife glanced at me, then away, her smile frozen in place like a photograph already out of season. I folded my napkin slowly, pressing the creases so my hands would not shake. Dead weight. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel in tone. It was worse. It was casual, like I was a line item on a budget, not a mother at a table. I wanted to remind him of nights in that cold garage, of rent notices I peeled off doors before neighbors could see, of the sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, the coffee poured while bills sat unpaid. But I didn't. I looked at my casserole dish, steam still curling, cornbread golden, and I thought how strange it was that love could be laid out so warm, only to be left untouched. So I set down my fork, folded the napkin neatly, and pushed back from the table. "I'll wash the dishes later," I said, though we all knew I wouldn't. Upstairs, I took my 2 suitcases from the closet, one for clothes, one for photographs. That's all I allowed myself. By the time the porch light flicked on outside, I was already in the taxi, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror, my son's words ringing louder than the driver's radio. Dead weight. The weight was real, but it wasn't mine to carry anymore. The motel room smelled of damp carpet and cigarettes that no curtain could hide, the kind of place that charged by the week, not the night. I set my suitcases down on the floral bedspread and sat there, staring at the peeling wallpaper like it might spell out an answer. The silence was heavy. No hum of his old space heater, no typing in the garage, no sound of someone depending on me, just the ice machine groaning down the hall and the thin rattle of a heater that never caught up with the cold. I pulled the curtains shut against the parking lot lights and opened the second suitcase, the one with photographs, faded birthday candles, a boy in a Halloween cape, his smile too wide for his face. I pressed the photos to my chest until I couldn't anymore. Tears came slow like reluctant guests, but once they started, they stayed. I whispered into the dark, "I gave you everything. Was it really nothing?" The walls, thin as they were, didn't answer. On the third night, after another dinner of vending machine crackers and lukewarm tea, I reached for the shoebox I always kept tucked under the lining of my case. It was old cardboard, edges frayed, the kind that creaked when you opened it. Inside were scraps of a life, my mother's brooch, my wedding ring wrapped in tissue, and at the bottom, an envelope I had never opened. The handwriting was hers, my mother's. Faint, slanted, careful. On the front, "For Margaret, when the time is right." I tore it open with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed, folded in thirds. It was from her lawyer, dated years back, explaining a trust left in my name by the family she worked for as a maid. Money set aside quietly, never spoken of. Modest, but real. Enough to do something with, if I was careful. There was also a name, a law office, still in town. I read the letter 3 times, my tears drying into resolve. The motel's heater rattled again, as if echoing my choice. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than sorrow. Not anger, not revenge. Something steadier, a way forward. I pressed the letter flat on the bedside table and whispered, "Thank you, Mama." The next morning, I dressed in my neatest blouse, the one with pearl buttons that always made me feel like I had a seat at any table, even if no one offered me one. I folded the letter into my purse and took the bus downtown. The law office was in an old brick building, its brass directory plate dulled by fingerprints and time. Inside, the halls smelled of lemon polish and paper, the kind of place where whispers seemed louder than shouts. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice brisk but not unkind. I handed her the letter. My fingers wanted to shake, but I pressed them steady against the counter. She glanced down, eyes widening just slightly, then nodded. One moment. Minutes later, I was seated across from a man whose hair was more silver than gray, his tie knotted with the kind of care you only give when you've been wearing them for 40 years. He unfolded the letter slowly, like it was a fragile thing. After a long pause, he looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," he said. "Yes," I whispered. "She was." Then he explained. There had been a trust, modest by most standards, but left untouched for decades. With careful investment, it had grown quietly, like seeds planted in secret soil. It was mine now, if I wanted it. I listened as he outlined the options, distributions, accounts, tax implications. The words felt heavy at first, the kind of language I had never been invited to understand, But instead of letting the weight crush me, I leaned in. I told him, I want to learn. So we met again and again. Each time, I brought a plate of cookies, because that's how I know to say thank you. Each time, he brought another set of papers, teaching me to read leases, balance sheets, the fine print hidden between bold promises. He suggested forming an LLC, something clean, private, protective. A new name, a new foundation. We filled out forms together, initials and signatures stacking like bricks. I chose a name that meant nothing to anyone else. ML Holdings, my mother's initials. A quiet way of carrying her into every room I would step into from now on. One afternoon, as we combed through city property listings, a document caught my eye. A commercial building on the edge of downtown, 3 stories of glass and brick, currently leased to several small companies, including one I knew very well, my son's startup. The owner, an aging landlord, was looking to exit. The rent rolls were months in arrears. The price, while steep, was within reach of the trust. I traced my finger over the address, heart thudding. It wasn't revenge I felt, it was recognition. Life had just handed me the same building that had once been my son's pride, and now, for the first time in years, I had the power to decide what would happen to it. I closed the folder gently, as if sealing the moment. "This one," I said. The lawyer tilted his head, searching my face. "You're sure?" I nodded. More than sure. The weeks that followed were a blur of papers and signatures, initials in tiny boxes, wires that hummed unseen through banks and servers until they landed on a screen in my lawyer's office. I had always thought deals were loud things, people in suits, shaking hands across shining tables, champagne bottles popped open in back rooms. But my deal was quiet. It lived in envelopes, in notary stamps, in whispered confirmations over a desk that smelled faintly of lemon polish. The landlord was an older man, Mr. Whitaker, his shoulders rounded by years of collecting checks that stopped arriving on time. He wanted out. No fuss, no fight, just someone to take the burden of the building before it swallowed him whole. I sat across from him in a coffee shop, my lawyer at my side, while rain ticked against the windows. "You'll take care of it?" he asked, his voice hopeful, like he wanted more than just money, he wanted peace. "I will," I said, and I meant it. We signed the agreement with ballpoint pens on napkin-thin contracts, and just like that, the building was mine. Or rather, it belonged to ML Holdings, my mother's initials pressed into embossed paper, now inked into county records. The deed arrived in a thick envelope. I carried it home like it was glass. In my little motel room, I lay it on the bedspread and pressed my palm against the seal. Not out of triumph, out of reverence. The next morning, I visited the building. 3 stories of glass and steel humming with lights and computer screens inside. I stood on the sidewalk, watching young people with coffee cups hurry through the doors, laughing, talking, carrying the kind of energy that only comes when you believe tomorrow belongs to you. And there, on the 2nd floor, was the name of my son's company, painted in proud white letters across the glass. I traced the air with my finger, spelling it out like I had when he first told me the name, his eyes shining with possibility. Back then, I had whispered it to myself in the kitchen just to feel closer to his dream. Now, the letters looked different. They were still bold, still hopeful, but they rested on a foundation that I now owned, quietly, legally, entirely. Standing there, I whispered what had become my mantra through this whole strange journey. No game, just business. I didn't storm inside. I didn't demand anything. I simply walked the block, noted the maintenance issues, the flickering light in the lobby, the cracked tile near the elevator, the planter outside that needed fresh soil. Stewardship, not vengeance. Back at the motel, I drafted my first set of notices. Not harsh, not threatening, clear, professional. Updates on safety checks, policies for late rent, invitations to a tenants meeting the following week. My son's company would get the same notice as every other tenant, printed on plain white paper with the letterhead of ML Holdings. No hint of who I was. Not yet. As the envelopes slid into the outgoing mail bin, I felt something settle in me. Not anger, not pride, something steadier. For the first time in a long time, the weight I carried wasn't crushing me. It was holding me up. The envelopes went out on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, I knew they had landed. You can always tell when a letter changes the air. Phones ring differently. Emails arrive sharper, faster. People start talking in hushed tones they think no one else can hear. The notices were plain, nothing more than what any new landlord would send. Policy update number 1. Rent must be current by the 5th of the month. Policy update number 2. Maintenance requests submitted through the new portal. Policy update number 3. Mandatory tenants meeting in the common room Monday at 9 a.m. No drama, no flourish, just structure. But structure, when you've been living on borrowed time, feels like an earthquake. By Saturday, my lawyer forwarded me a string of emails. Some tenants were relieved. Finally, someone was addressing the flickering lights and the leaking roof. Others were nervous. Change always unsettles people. And then there was one email that stood out. It came from the account I knew by heart, my son's. The subject line read, "Who do you think you are?" The body was worse. Accusations, bluster, a demand to speak to the so-called owner immediately. I didn't respond. Silence is sometimes the strongest sentence. Instead, I spent Sunday in quiet preparation. I walked the halls of the building early in the morning, clipboard in hand, taking notes the way a caretaker might. The cracked tile, the dusty exit signs, the blinds that didn't close properly on the west side, little things that spoke louder about stewardship than any title could. I nodded at tenants as they passed. Some nodded back, polite but cautious. One woman in a nurse's uniform smiled gratefully when I held the door. She didn't know who I was yet. That was fine. The truth didn't need rushing. By Sunday night, I laid out my clothes for the meeting. Not fancy, just neat, steady. Pearl button blouse, pressed slacks, shoes polished until I could see my face. I wasn't dressing for triumph. I was dressing for presence. At dawn Monday, I arrived early. The common room smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner, the kind of scent that says something important is about to happen. Rows of folding chairs were lined up, a projector humming quietly in the corner. One by one, tenants filed in. The music teacher with her tote bag, the man who always wore a cap pulled low, the nurse that I had seen before. They settled into their seats with the wary patience of people who had been through enough landlord talks to expect very little. Then I heard the heavy footsteps, my son's voice already raised before he even entered the room, his wife trailing behind, lips pressed tight. He walked in like a storm, loud enough to command attention, angry enough to try and fill the silence before it was his. I stayed seated in the front row, hands folded, face calm. The property manager tapped the microphone, clearing his throat. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. As you know, the building recently changed hands. The new owner wanted to introduce themselves and share plans for improvements." He turned toward me, gesturing. "Please welcome the owner of ML Holdings." I rose slowly. The room hushed. My son's eyes widened, anger dissolving into something else. Confusion first, then disbelief, then a dawning recognition that rippled through his whole body. "Good morning," I said, voice steady. "I'm Margaret, and as of last week, I am your landlord." The words hung in the air like church bells, plain, resonant, undeniable. The silence in the room was so sharp I could hear the hum of the projector. My son's mouth opened, then closed again like the words had locked themselves somewhere he couldn't reach. I didn't smirk. I didn't gloat. I simply stood, smoothing the crease of my blouse, and looked not at him, but at the room. First, I said thank you all for being here. This building has good bones, but it also has cracks, leaks, lights, locks. My commitment is to fix those, to make this a place you can be proud to come to work each day. That's what stewardship looks like. A nurse nodded, the music teacher leaned forward, someone coughed, waiting for more. Then I turned toward the second row, toward my son and his wife. His jaw was tight, fists pressed against his knees. "And for Nexera Labs," I continued, using the company's name with care, "there are choices to make." I lifted a single sheet of paper from the folder in my hand. The paper was crisp, the ink bold. I held it up so everyone could see. "Option 1, I said. "You bring your rent current. I will cover the arrears, but only if we set terms. An independent controller to oversee finances, payroll guaranteed before profit, and your resignation as CEO. You'll remain founder in name, but leadership must change for the company to survive." Gasps rippled through the room. My son's eyes flashed, but I raised a hand before he could speak. "Option 2, I said, lowering the sheet to the table. "You vacate this suite within 60 days. Your employees will be offered space on the 3rd floor under a new lease. Discounted, fair, with first month forgiven. Severance packages will be provided for those who don't stay. Nexera can dissolve, but the people who carried it won't be left in the cold." The room was no longer silent. Whispers buzzed between rows. A young man in a Nexera hoodie exchanged a glance with the woman beside him. Your eyes didn't say betrayal. They said relief. My son shot up from his chair, his voice shaking with fury. "You can't do this. This is my company, my building, my future." I met his gaze, calm and steady. "No," I said softly. "It's your responsibility, and responsibility comes with choices. These are yours." I slid the paper across the table, the sound of it skimming wood louder than his shouting. Behind him, an employee whispered, "She's giving us a chance." Another nodded. The storm in my son's face faltered. Rage still burned, but beneath it I saw something else flicker. Fear. The kind that comes when you realize power isn't just about titles, but about how you hold people's lives in your hands. I looked back at the room. "This isn't about punishment," I said. "It's about survival. And survival doesn't happen through bluster. It happens through care." Then I folded my hands, sat back down, and let the paper sit between us like a mirror neither of us could avoid. By the next morning, my inbox was a battlefield. Subject lines like shouts, "This isn't over. You'll regret this. I built this, not you." All from my son. I read each one carefully, not because I wanted to, but because I knew in times like these, silence has to be informed. His words tumbled with fury. Accusations of betrayal, threats to go public, promises that he would ruin me before he ruined me. I didn't reply, not a single line. Instead, I forwarded them to my attorney. He called me that afternoon, his voice steady, practiced. "You've done the right thing," he said. Then he drafted a response, not from me, but from the office of ML Holdings. It was simple, calm, a record, not a quarrel. "We acknowledge receipt of your correspondence. All communications going forward must be in writing through counsel. Please be advised that any defamatory or threatening remarks will be documented and responded to in accordance with the lease agreement and applicable law. That was it. No emotion, no venom, just paper. I read the draft twice and approved it with one word: send. That night I sat by the motel window, watching rain streak the glass. His anger was loud, but my silence was louder. For the first time, I understood that power doesn't have to shout. Sometimes it just waits. And the waiting worked. The next week, the emails slowed, the threats softened into complaints, the complaints into silence. Employees began reaching out privately, not with defiance, but with questions. What would the future look like? Would their jobs survive? I answered each one carefully, not as his mother, but as their landlord. Clear, concise, professional. Yes, the building would remain open. Yes, their work was valued. Yes, they had choices. The storm in my inbox passed. What remained was a steady stream of people looking not for drama, but for direction. And quietly, I realized something. The man who had called me dead weight was thrashing in deep water, but the people around him, they were ready to swim. All they needed was someone willing to hold the shoreline steady. The meeting was set for Friday morning. I arrived early, as I always did, walking the halls before anyone else. The lights buzzed faintly overhead, the scent of stale coffee drifting from break rooms. Each door bore a name, each desk a story. People who had carried my son's dream long after he stopped carrying them. By 9 o'clock, the conference room was full. The employees of Nexera Labs filed in, shoulders tense, eyes darting between me and the sheet of paper I'd placed at the center of the table. My son sat at the head, jaw tight, hands gripping the armrests like anchors. I began calmly. You've all read the options. Today is about your decision, not mine, not his. I nodded towards my son. His eyes burned, but he said nothing. A young man in the hoodie, the same one I'd noticed at the tenant meeting, spoke first. Option 1 keeps us working, right? We still get paid. Yes, I said. Payroll first, always. A woman with tired eyes and a badge that read controller spoke next. And option 2 gives us the space upstairs, with severance if we don't stay. Yes, I answered again. The room murmured, heads leaned together. Whispers turned into voices, voices into clarity. Finally, the woman lifted her chin. We choose option 1, with conditions. He steps down. Her gaze flicked to my son, then back to me. You'll make sure it happens. I placed my hand gently on the paper. I'll make sure. All eyes turned to him. His face, once a mask of confidence, cracked at the edges. He laughed, but it was hollow, brittle. You can't just replace me. This is my company. One by one, his team shook their heads, quiet, resolute. It's our work, someone whispered. Our late nights, another said. Our lives, a third added. The storm inside him broke then. His hands loosened, his shoulders sagged. He looked at me, his mother, not as an enemy, but as something worse in his mind, the mirror he couldn't avoid. At last, he pushed his chair back. The scrape against the floor echoed louder than his words. Fine, he muttered. I'll resign. No gavel struck. No applause followed. Just a silence that felt like oxygen returning to the room. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I reached into my folder and slid a second document forward. Then let's sign, and let's begin again. He picked up the pen with trembling fingers. The ink flowed across the page, his name etched into history, not as a founder, but as a man who had been asked to step aside. When it was done, I collected the papers carefully, tucking them into my folder like fragile glass. Then I looked around the room, not at my son, but at the people who had carried his vision on their backs. You're not alone, I told them. Not anymore. The days that followed were quieter. The office hummed with a steadier rhythm, like a machine finally oiled after grinding for too long. Paychecks went out on time. The lights in the lobby no longer flickered. For the first time in years, the tenant spoke of hope instead of rumors. And then one evening, as the sun folded itself into the horizon, my intercom buzzed. "Mom?" It was his voice, small, uncertain, a sound I hadn't heard since the garage days, when every idea he had was fragile enough to break with one wrong word. I pressed the button. "Come up." He arrived without the sharp suit, without the swagger, just a wrinkled shirt and eyes ringed with exhaustion. He stood in my doorway like a boy again, not a man with a company. I gestured toward the couch. He sat, shoulders bowed, hands twisting in his lap. He said finally. The words fell heavy, but they were honest. I was wrong. I thought power meant control, but it just made me afraid all the time. Afraid of losing it. Afraid of looking weak. I poured 2 mugs of tea, the way I always had, setting his in front of him without ceremony. "You weren't afraid of being weak," I said gently. "You were afraid of being cared for. There's a difference." He stared at the steam rising from the cup. For the first time, he didn't argue. "I don't know who I am without all of it," he whispered. "You're my son. That's enough, and you'll figure out the rest, if you let yourself start from the ground instead of the pedestal." We sat in silence after that. Not the brittle silence of a dinner table where words were weapons, but the soft kind. The kind that heals, even without answers. When he left, he didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for the company back. He just paused at the door and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I watched him walk down the hallway, shoulders still heavy, but a little straighter than before. Sometimes repair doesn't come with a grand gesture. Sometimes it begins with a cup of tea and a sentence you thought you'd never hear. Spring came, and with it, light through the glass walls of the building I now cared for. The tenants walked in with steadier steps. The mail slots filled with checks that arrived on time. The nurse in the hallway finally smiled without looking over her shoulder. But I wanted more than just balance sheets and leases. I wanted legacy, something bigger than survival. So I took the top floor, the one with the wide windows and the scuffed hardwood, and I gave it a new name, Second Shift. It was a space for founders over 50, for caregivers looking to build something of their own, for women who had been told they were too old, too tired, too late. Desks were offered at half the going rate. Coffee was always on. Advice was free. On opening day, the room filled with people who carried not just laptops, but stories. A retired teacher with an idea for a literacy app. A grandmother who had turned her crochet into an online shop. A nurse, the same one from my hallway, who wanted to design better scheduling software after years of night shifts. They sat together, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Laughter spilled down the stairwell. Energy returned to a building that once only knew tension. And as I stood at the back of the room, watching, I thought of my mother. The shoebox, the letter, her careful handwriting. She had left me the seed, and I had planted it here in this room full of people starting over. That evening, I locked the doors and turned off the lights, the city glowing outside. I whispered into the quiet what had become the only words worth repeating. No game, just business, and business can be kind. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and added the line I always end with, because it's not just mine, it belongs to anyone who's ever been dismissed, diminished, or called dead weight. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.